The darkness over the English Channel on the night of June 5th, 1944, was absolute. No moon pierced the heavy cloud cover, and the only sounds were the rhythmic slapping of waves against the hulls of nearly 7,000 vessels stretched across the Blackwater. Inside the cramped quarters of landing ship Tank 125, Staff Sergeant William Bull Murphy of the 1st Infantry Division pressed his rosary beads. Between calloused fingers, whispering prayers he hadn't spoken since childhood, the ship lurched violently as it cut through 12-foot swells, and Murphy heard the familiar sound of retching from the bunks around him. These were hardened veterans of North Africa and Sicily, men who had faced Rommel's panzers in the desert and fought house to house in Italian towns, whose names they couldn't pronounce, yet here they were, seasick as schoolboys on their first fishing trip. "Hey, Sarge," whispered Private Tommy Kowalski from the bunk below, his voice barely audible over the groaning of the ship's hull. "You think we'll make it home for Christmas?" Murphy had heard that question 100 times in a dozen different languages across 3 continents. He'd stopped trying to answer it honestly months ago. "Course we will, kid. Hitler's throwing in the towel any day now." But Murphy knew better. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans had fortified the French coast with everything they had left. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself had overseen the construction of what they called the Atlantic Wall, a network of concrete bunkers, steel obstacles, and interlocking fields of fire that stretched from Norway to Spain. The beaches they were heading toward codenamed Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword were bristling with 88mm guns, machine gun nests, and enough barbed wire to fence off half of Texas, according to a detailed analysis published in the London Times Military Correspondent's Wartime Memoirs. The Allied planners had calculated acceptable losses of up to 10,000 men just to establish the initial beachheads. Murphy had read those estimates, and he knew that acceptable losses meant that 1 in every 10 men in his landing craft might not see another sunset. The ship's intercom crackled to life with the voice of Captain James Richardson, the vessel's commanding officer. "Gentlemen, we're approximately 4 hours from the Norman coast. Weather conditions remain marginal, but General Eisenhower has given the final go-ahead for Operation Overlord. Check your equipment one final time. This is what we've been training for." Murphy rolled off his bunk and began the ritual he'd performed before every major engagement. First, the M1 Garand rifle 8 rounds in the clip, safety engaged, barrel clean as a whistle. Then the ammunition bandoliers for fragmentation grenades, 1 smoke grenade, and his treasured trench knife with the brass knuckle guard. Finally, the waterproof bag containing 3 days' worth of K-rations, morphine syrettes, and a field dressing kit dot around him. 200 other soldiers performed the same ritual in the amber glow of the ship's red battle lights. There was young Kowalski, barely 19, adjusting the straps on his pack for the 100th time. Corporal Martinez from El Paso checked and rechecked his radio equipment, knowing that communication would mean the difference between coordinated advance and chaotic slaughter. Sergeant O'Brien from Boston sharpened his bayonet with methodical strokes of his whetstone, the scraping sound somehow more ominous than the storm outside. These men represented every corner of America: farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California who left their books to pick up rifles. They'd been molded into a fighting unit through months of brutal training in England, where they practiced amphibious assaults until they could load into landing craft in complete darkness and establish beachheads with their eyes closed. But no amount of training could prepare them for what waited beyond that dark horizon. The German 5th to 2nd Infantry Division had spent for years turning the Norman beaches into a killing ground, and every man in landing ship Tank 125 knew that sunrise would bring either liberation or death. The 1st German artillery shell exploded 300 yards to starboard at exactly 05:45 hours, sending a geyser of seawater 30 feet into the air. The sound rolled across the water like thunder, and suddenly the illusion of stealth was shattered. Fortress Europe knew they were coming. Staff Sergeant Murphy felt the familiar tightening in his chest as adrenaline flooded his system. Around him, the faces of his men had gone pale in the dawn light filtering through the porthole. The ship's engines changed pitch as Captain Richardson ordered flank speed toward the beach, designated as Omaha Easy Red Sector. Through the growing light, Murphy could make out the coastline for the first time, a crescent of sand backed by towering bluffs that bristled with concrete emplacements. Tracer fire began to arc across the water in lazy streams of death. Deceptively beautiful, until they pass close enough. They hear the angry buzz of bullets cutting through the air. Landing craft away, the order echoed through the ship's corridors, and Murphy led his section up the narrow steel stairs to the deck. The scene that greeted them was like something from Danny's vision of hell. The English Channel had become a cauldron of exploding shells, burning landing craft, and desperate men struggling in the water. The Higgins boat that would carry Murphy's section to the beach was already being lowered on its davits, piloted by coxswain Jerry Palmer, a 22-year-old Coast Guardsman from Maine who looked like he should be hauling lobster traps instead of dodging artillery shells. Palmer's hands were steady on the wheel despite the chaos erupting around them, and Murphy felt a surge of confidence in the young sailor. 36 men, coxswain. Murphy shouted over the din of engines and explosions. Get us to that beach in one piece. Palmer nodded grimly, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Roger that, Sergeant. Hold on tight. The landing craft lurched away from the mother ship and immediately began taking on spray from the heavy seas. Murphy watched his men brace themselves against the steel sides of the boat, their faces reflecting the orange glow of burning vessels scattered across the water. In the distance, he could see the battleship USS Texas hurling 16-inch shells toward the German positions, each impact sending up massive columns of smoke and debris. But something was wrong. The preliminary bombardment that was supposed to soften up the German defenses had clearly failed. Instead of silenced bunkers and shattered obstacles, Murphy could see muzzle flashes winking along the entire length of the bluff. Machine gun bullets began to ping off the armored ramp of their landing craft. With increasing frequency, Private Kowalski was violently seasick again, but Murphy noticed the kid had chambered a round in his rifle and fixed his bayonet. Combat had a way of focusing the mind wonderfully. Corporal Martinez was frantically trying to raise division headquarters on his radio, but the set was taking on water and producing only static. As detailed in historian Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive account of the Normandy invasion, the first wave of assault troops faced conditions far worse than anyone had anticipated. The naval bombardment had fallen short, the Air Force had dropped their bombs to far inland, and the German resistance was both fierce and well-coordinated. 100 yards from shore, Palmer's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Ramp going down in 30 seconds. When I drop this thing, you move fast and you don't stop until you reach that seawall. Murphy could see the beach obstacles, now massive steel hedgehogs, and Belgian gates designed to rip the bottom out of landing craft. Some were topped with mines that would detonate on contact. Bodies floated in the surf, and wounded men clung to the obstacles, crying for medics in voices that would haunt Murphy's dreams. For the rest of his life, the water around their boat began to foam with machine gun fire from the WN-72 Strong Point, a concrete bunker built into the bluff that commanded the entire Easy Red sector. Murphy could see the muzzle flash of the MG-42 machine gun that was systematically destroying everything that moved on the beach below. 10 seconds, Palmer screamed. Murphy rose to his feet, his legs trembling not from fear, but from the primitive anticipation that every combat soldier knows around him. 35 other men prepared to charge into hell, armed with nothing but rifles, determination, and the desperate hope that they would live to see another day. The steel ramp crashed down into 3 feet of churning, bloody water, and Staff Sergeant William Murphy led his men into the most important battle of their lives. The water was shockingly cold and deeper than expected. Staff Sergeant Murphy plunged in up to his chest, his waterlogged equipment dragging him down as machine gun bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. Around him, his men struggled through the surf, some falling immediately as German fire found its mark, others pressing forward with grim determination etched on their faces. Private Kowalski went down 20 yards from the landing craft, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. Murphy grabbed the kid's belt and hauled him toward a steel hedgehog that offered minimal cover from the devastating fire pouring down from the bluffs. I could still fight, Sarge, Kowalski gasped, trying to bring his rifle to bear despite his wounded arm. You just worry about staying alive, kid, Murphy replied, pressing the field dressing against the wound. Around them, the beach had become a killing field. Bodies floated in the tide pools, and the sand was stained red with the blood of young men who would never see home again. The German Strong Point WN-72 continued its methodical destruction of everything that moved on Easy Red sector. The MG-42 machine gun could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, and the crew had pre-registered every inch of the beach for maximum effect. Murphy watched helplessly as an entire section from Baker Company was cut down, trying to advance across an open stretch of sand. Corporal Martinez had managed to get his radio working, despite the water damage and fragments of desperate transmissions crackled through the static. Doc Green taking heavy casualties. Need immediate naval gunfire support. Sector 7 is a complete loss. Murphy knew they couldn't stay pinned down on the beach. The rising tide would eventually eliminate what little cover they had, and the German artillery was beginning to find the range. He spotted a narrow gully carved into the bluff, about 200 yards to the east, a natural approach that might offer some protection from the machine gun fire. Martinez, can you raise the Texas? The corporal nodded, pressing the radio handset against his ear. This is Easy Red Actual to Fire Mission Control. We need immediate support on grid reference. The response came through clearly this time. Easy Red Actual, this is Texas Fire Control. We show friendly forces in your target area. Cannot engage without positive identification of targets. Murphy cursed under his breath. The naval gunfire support teams were supposed to be on the beach by now, calling in precision strikes against the German positions. But like everything else about this assault, the plan had disintegrated under the brutal reality of combat. According to veteran war correspondent Ernie Powell's first-hand accounts of the Normandy landings, published later in his book Brave Men, the chaos on Omaha Beach during the first hour was absolute. Communication had broken down, units were scattered, and the carefully rehearsed tactics proved worthless against the ferocious German resistance. Sergeant O'Brien from Boston had gathered the remnants of 2 squads behind a disabled Sherman tank that had been knocked out during an earlier wave. The tank's armor was pitted with bullet holes, but it provided solid cover from the machine gun fire. O'Brien was methodically picking off German positions with his Springfield rifle, his peacetime job as a deer hunter in the Maine woods serving him well. Murphy, O'Brien called out, I can see a way up that draw to the east. If we can get some covering fire, we might be able to flank that bunker. Murphy studied the terrain through his binoculars, trying to ignore the bullets that occasionally sparked off the steel obstacles around him. The gully was narrow and would channel his men into a perfect killing zone, but it was the only approach that offered any chance of success. The alternative was to stay pinned down on the beach until the tide came in and drowned them all. Martinez, tell the Texas we're marking our position with yellow smoke. Any bunker firing after we pop smoke is fair game for naval gunfire. The corporal relayed the message and received immediate confirmation. Murphy pulled the pin on his smoke grenade and hurled it as far up the beach as his wounded arm would allow. The yellow smoke billowed in the offshore breeze, clearly marking the American positions. 3 minutes later, the first 16-inch shell from the USS Texas screamed overhead like an express train, impacting directly on the concrete roof of Strong Point WN-72. The explosion was tremendous, sending chunks of reinforced concrete spinning through the air like deadly confetti. The machine gun fire from the bunker ceased abruptly. That's our cue, Murphy shouted, rising from cover and waving his men forward. First squad advanced by rushes to that gully. Second squad covering fire. The surviving members of his section rose from behind their scattered cover and began the deadliest foot race of their lives. Murphy led from the front, his boots pounding across the sand as German rifle fire cracked around him. Behind him, he could hear Private Kowalski cursing steadily in Polish as he struggled to keep up despite his wounded shoulder. They had covered perhaps 50 yards when the machine gun in bunker WN-74 opened up from a flanking position Murphy hadn't spotted. The stream of tracer bullets cut across their path like a deadly scythe, and Murphy dove for cover behind a pile of demolished concrete, his heart hammering against his ribs. They were trapped again, caught between the rising tide and an enemy that seemed to have an endless supply of ammunition and an intimate knowledge of every inch of killing ground. Murphy checked his watch. It was only 07:15 hours. The longest hour of his life was just beginning. The machine gun in Strong Point WN-74 had them pinned down completely. Every time one of Murphy's men tried to advance, a stream of tracer bullets would force them back behind cover. The German gunner was a professional, conserving ammunition and firing in precise 3-round bursts. That bracketed any movement on the beach below. Murphy pressed himself against the pile of broken concrete that served as his only protection and tried to assess the situation. Half his section was wounded or dead. Ammunition was running low, and the tide was creeping steadily higher. In another hour, their position would be completely submerged. That's when he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. A lone figure was crawling through the surf about 30 yards to his right, dragging what looked like a Bangalore torpedo, a long tube packed with explosives. Designed to clear wire obstacles, Murphy squinted through the smoke and spray and recognized the man immediately. Staff Sergeant Robert Mad Dog Sullivan from Charlie Company, a former coal miner from Pennsylvania who had a reputation for taking impossible risks. Sullivan had somehow made it farther up the beach than anyone else, and he was methodically working his way toward the base of the bluff where a tangle of barbed wire blocked the only natural path to the German positions. The Bangalore torpedo he was dragging weighed nearly 40 pounds, and he was pulling it through the sand using nothing but his elbows and knees, while machine gun bullets whined inches over his head. "That crazy son of a bitch is going to get himself killed," muttered Corporal Martinez, who had crawled up beside Murphy with his radio still strapped to his back. But Murphy recognized what Sullivan was attempting. If he could get close enough to detonate the Bangalore torpedo against the wire obstacles, it would blow a gap wide enough for an entire company to advance through. It was a one-way mission. The explosion would certainly draw every German gun on the bluff, and Sullivan would be caught in the open with nowhere to hide. Murphy made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Martinez, get on the radio to every unit you can raise. Tell them to concentrate all available fire on those bunkers in exactly 3 minutes. Everything they've got: rifles, machine guns, bazookas, mortars. We're gonna give Sullivan some cover." The corporal began frantically calling out over the radio network, and within minutes Murphy could hear acknowledgments crackling through the static. The surviving elements of at least 6 different companies were still clinging to life on Omaha Beach, and they were all willing to expose themselves to give Sullivan a fighting chance, as documented in the Medal of Honor citations archived in the National Personnel Record Center. The individual acts of heroism on D-Day often made the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat. Men like Staff Sergeant Sullivan embodied the spirit that ultimately carried the day, despite impossible odds. Meanwhile, Private Kowalski had fashioned a makeshift sling for his wounded arm and was methodically checking the rifle ammunition among the scattered members of their section. Despite his injury, the kid had become the squad's unofficial armorer, redistributing bullets and grenades to ensure everyone had enough firepower for the coming assault. "Sarge," Kowalski said quietly, "I found something you need to see." He handed Murphy a waterlogged map case that had belonged to one of the dead German prisoners they'd found washed up in the surf, apparently a courier who had been caught in the preliminary bombardment. Inside the case was a detailed schematic of the German defensive positions, complete with firing angles, ammunition storage locations, and communication trenches. Murphy studied the map with growing excitement. The bunkers were connected by a network of underground tunnels that led to a central command post built into the reverse slope of the bluff. If they could fight their way to that command post, they might be able to coordinate the entire German defense system from within. "Martinez, can you patch me through to Colonel Taylor?" Colonel Norman Taylor, commander of the 16th Infantry Regiment, had become a legend on Omaha Beach by walking upright through the heaviest fire, rallying scattered units and personally directing attacks against German strong points. His voice came through the radio with crystal clarity despite the chaos around them. "This is Taylor. What's your situation?" "Murphy, sir. We've got intelligence on the German tunnel system. If we can coordinate a simultaneous assault from multiple directions, we might be able to crack this thing wide open." There was a pause while Taylor digested the information. "Roger that, Murphy. Sullivan's about to blow that wire in 30 seconds. When he does, I want you to take every man you can find and head straight up that draw. Don't stop for anything. The Germans won't expect a frontal assault after the beating we've taken." Murphy could see Sullivan rising to his knees in the surf, the Bangalore torpedo positioned against the base of the wire obstacles. The sergeant's uniform was shredded from crawling across the sand, and blood streamed from multiple wounds, but his hands were steady as he prepared to light the fuse. All units, all units." Murphy called into his radio handset, "Covering fire in 5 seconds. Give them everything you've got." The beach erupted in a coordinated wall of fire as every surviving American weapon opened up simultaneously. Rifle bullets sparked off concrete, machine gun tracers painted bright lines across the bluff, and bazooka rockets exploded against the bunker apertures in brilliant flashes of orange flame. In the midst of this tremendous barrage, Staff Sergeant Robert Sullivan lit the fuse on his Bangalore torpedo and crawled away as fast as his wounded legs would carry him. The explosion, when it came, tore a gap 30 feet wide through the German wire, sending twisted metal spiraling high into the air. Now, Murphy screamed, rising from cover and waving his remaining men forward. "Follow me." They charged across, the sand like men possessed, their battle cry echoing across Omaha Beach as they raced toward the gap. That Sullivan's sacrifice had torn in Fortress Europe's armor. Behind them, the tide continued to rise, erasing the footprints of heroes in the Norman sand. The explosion of Sullivan's Bangalore torpedo had done more than just clear the wire. It had stunned the German defenders long enough for Murphy's assault, forced to gain precious ground up the treacherous slope. What had started as a desperate charge by the remnants of a single section had become a company-sized attack as men from scattered units converged on the gap. In the German defenses, Murphy found himself leading nearly 60 soldiers up the narrow draw, their boots slipping on loose sand and shale as machine gun bullets whined overhead. Private Kowalski was right behind him despite his wounded shoulder. The kid's face set in grim determination as he clutched his rifle with white knuckles. The German map they'd recovered proved invaluable as they navigated the maze of trenches and communication tunnels that honeycombed the bluff. Murphy could see exactly where the next defensive position should be, and he was able to direct flanking maneuvers that caught the defenders by surprise. "Contact front." Sergeant O'Brien's voice cut through the din of battle as his squad encountered a German machine gun nest built into the reverse slope of the hill. The MG-42 opened up immediately, forcing the Americans to dive for cover among the shell holes and abandoned equipment that littered the battlefield. Murphy studied the position through his binoculars and quickly identified the problem. The machine gun was positioned to cover the main approach, but there was a dead angle to the left where a mortar crater provided concealment, almost to within grenade range. "Martinez, can you still raise artillery support?" The corporal was hunched over his radio, trying to establish communication with the fire direction center on the beach below. "Negative, Sarge. Too much interference from all the metal in these hills. But I've got contact with Lieutenant Morrison's platoon. They're about 200 yards to our right and moving up parallel to us." Murphy made a quick decision. "Tell Morrison to fix them in place with covering fire. We're going to rush that position from the blind side." What followed was a textbook small unit assault that Murphy had practiced hundreds of times in training but never expected to execute under combat conditions. While Morrison's men poured rifle fire into the German position from the front, Murphy led a squad around the flank using the mortar crater for concealment. The German crew never saw them coming. Murphy's grenade landed squarely in the machine gun pit, and the explosion was followed immediately by the crack of rifle fire as his men swept through the position. When the smoke cleared, 3 German soldiers lay dead beside their weapon, and the advance could continue, but their success had not gone unnoticed. As they crested the ridge line, Murphy found himself looking down into a natural amphitheater, where the Germans had constructed their main command bunker. The reinforced concrete structure was built into the hillside like a medieval fortress, with interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. According to classified after-action reports that were declassified decades later by the National Archives, the German 52nd Infantry Division had turned this position into the keystone of their entire defensive system on Omaha Beach. From here, they could coordinate artillery fire, direct reinforcements, and maintain communication with higher headquarters. "Jesus Christ," whispered Corporal Martinez as he surveyed the fortress through his binoculars. "How the hell are we supposed to take that thing?" Murphy was wondering the same thing when he noticed movement in the valley below. A column of German infantry was moving up from the rear, at least a company's worth of reinforcements responding to the American breakthrough. If those troops reached the bunker, they would have enough firepower to hold the position indefinitely. "We've got to take that bunker now, before those reinforcements arrive," Murphy told his assembled squad leaders. "It's the only way we're going to break through this defensive line." Private Kowalski had been studying the German map with the intensity of a scholar, and suddenly he looked up with excitement. "Sarge, look at this. There's a ventilation shaft that comes up behind the bunker, about 50 yards from the main entrance. If we could get a couple of guys with satchel charges down that shaft." Murphy examined the map more carefully and felt his pulse quicken. The ventilation system was designed to provide fresh air to the underground complex, but it also represented a potential weak point in the fortress's defenses. A well-placed demolition charge could collapse the entire structure. Martinez, how many satchel charges do we have left? 3, plus whatever Lieutenant Morrison's people are carrying. That'll have to do. Murphy studied the terrain one more time, calculating angles and distances with the precision of an artillery officer. O'Brien, take your squad and create a diversion at the main entrance. Make a lot of noise, but don't commit to a full assault. We just need to keep their attention. Focus forward. Sergeant O'Brien grinned and checked his watch. How long do you need? Give us 10 minutes to get into position, then raise hell. And whatever you do, don't let those reinforcements link up with the bunker garrison. Murphy selected Kowalski and the other volunteers for the demolition mission men, who were small enough to navigate the narrow ventilation shaft and experienced enough to place the charges effectively. They blackened their faces with mud and checked their equipment one final time, knowing that this mission would likely be their last dot as they prepared to move out. Murphy caught sight of a familiar figure working his way up the hill. Colonel Taylor himself, leading the remnants of another company in a desperate assault against the German positions on the eastern flank. The colonel's uniform was torn and bloody, but his voice carried clearly across the battlefield as he urged his men forward. That's what leadership looks like, Murphy muttered to himself as he led his small team toward the ventilation shaft. Around them, the sounds of battle continued to rage as American forces slowly, painfully clawed their way up the Norman cliffs that had seemed so impregnable just hours before. The fate of the entire invasion might depend on what happened in the next few minutes, and Staff Sergeant William Murphy intended to make sure that those minutes counted. The ventilation shaft was barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, and the first 20 feet dropped straight down into absolute darkness. Murphy lowered himself into the concrete tube feet first, his satchel charge strapped securely to his back as he used his elbows and knees to control his descent. Above him, Private Kowalski was already following, the kid's breathing echoing hollowly in the confined space. The shaft angled sharply after the initial drop, following the contours of the hillside as it snaked toward the main bunker complex. Murphy could hear the muffled sounds of battle filtering through the concrete walls, rifle fire, explosions, and the distinctive chatter of German machine guns responding to O'Brien's diversionary attack. After what felt like an eternity of crawling through the claustrophobic tunnel, Murphy saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. The ventilation shaft opened into a large underground chamber that served as the bunker's main communication center. Through the metal grating that covered the shaft opening, he could see German radio operators bent over their equipment, frantically coordinating the defense of the beach positions. Murphy carefully removed the grating and lowered himself into the chamber, his boots touching the concrete floor without making a sound. The German soldiers were so focused on their radios that they never noticed the muddy American sergeant who materialized behind them like a ghost. Kowalski dropped down beside him, followed by the 2 other volunteers, Corporal Harris from Detroit and Private Romano from New York. They moved with the practiced silence of experienced infantry, their weapons ready as they took in the layout of the underground complex. The bunker was larger than Murphy had expected, with multiple chambers, connected by narrow corridors that extended deep into the hillside. Through an open doorway, he could see a German officer studying a large map table, plotting defensive positions and marking the progress of American forces with colored pins. That officer, Murphy realized, was the key to the entire German defense. If they could capture him and his maps, they would have intelligence that could break open the entire Omaha Beach sector. But first, they had to neutralize the communication center and prevent the Germans from calling for reinforcements. Murphy signaled to his team, and they moved with deadly efficiency. Harris covered the main corridor, while Romano disabled the radio equipment with well-placed shots from his silenced pistol. Kowalski, despite his wounded arm, managed to secure the 2 radio operators before they could raise an alarm. The German officer in the next room must have heard something, because he suddenly appeared in the doorway with a Luger pistol in his hand. Murphy was faster, his M1 Garand barking once as the officer spun around and collapsed against the map table. "Secure those maps," Murphy whispered urgently. "Everything defensive positions, minefields, artillery coordinates. This intelligence could save thousands of lives." As documented in the official history of the 4th Infantry Division, compiled by the Army's Center of Military History, the capture of German planning documents during the Normandy invasion provided crucial intelligence that accelerated the Allied breakthrough and reduced casualty rates in subsequent operations. Kowalski was stuffing the captured maps into his waterproof bag when the first explosion rocked the bunker. O'Brien's diversionary attack had escalated into a full-scale assault, and Murphy could hear the distinctive whine of incoming artillery shells as American naval gunfire began to pound the German positions. "Time to go," Murphy announced, pulling the pin on his first satchel charge and setting the timer for 2 minutes. "Plant your charges in the ammunition storage room and the main support column. We want this whole place to come down." They worked quickly but methodically, placing the explosive charges at critical structural points throughout the bunker complex. Murphy could hear German voices shouting in the corridors above, and the sound of jackboots on concrete as the garrison began to realize they had been infiltrated. The last charge was placed against the main electrical panel that controlled the bunker's lighting and ventilation systems. When it detonated, the entire fortress would be plunged into darkness, making it impossible for the defenders to coordinate their resistance. 30 seconds, Murphy called out as they prepared to make their escape through a rear exit that led to a concealed trench system. "Stay together and keep moving. Once these charges blow, this whole hillside is going to be crawling with very angry Germans." They emerged from the bunker just as the first explosions began to chain react through the underground complex. The ground shook violently under their feet, and clouds of dust and debris erupted from ventilation shafts scattered across the hillside. The main bunker structure collapsed in on itself. With a grinding roar that could be heard for miles, Murphy led his team through the labyrinth of German trenches, using the captured maps to navigate toward the American lines. Behind them, the fortress that had dominated Omaha Beach for 4 years was now nothing but a pile of smoking rubble. But their mission wasn't over yet. The German reinforcements that Murphy had spotted earlier were still advancing up the valley, and without the coordination provided by the command bunker, they would likely retreat rather than continue their counterattack. That would leave the door wide open for the Allied forces to push inland and secure the vital road network that connected the landing beaches to the Norman countryside. As they reached the crest of the ridge, Murphy looked back toward the beach, where thousands of American soldiers were still fighting their way across the sand. The sun was higher now, burning through the morning haze to illuminate a scene of controlled chaos as men and equipment poured ashore in a steady stream. They had done it, against impossible odds. With inadequate preparation and devastating casualties, the Allies had broken through Hitler's Atlantic Wall and established a foothold in occupied Europe. The road to Berlin was finally open, and Staff Sergeant William Murphy had played his small part in opening it. By 1400 hours on June 6, 1944, the character of the battle had fundamentally changed. What had begun as a desperate struggle for survival on the beaches had evolved into a systematic advance inland as American forces exploited the gaps torn in the German defensive line. Murphy's demolition of the command bunker had created a domino effect that rippled along the entire Omaha Beach sector. Murphy found himself leading a combined force of nearly 200 men from a dozen different units, all converging on the vital crossroads at St. Lawrence-sur-Mer that would secure the inland approaches to the beachhead. The German forces, deprived of centralized command and control, were fighting a series of isolated defensive actions that lacked coordination and mutual support. The intelligence captured from the bunker had proven invaluable. Murphy now knew the locations of German ammunition dumps, the strength and disposition of reserve units, and most importantly, the routes being used to bring up reinforcements from the interior. This information had been radioed back to division headquarters, where it was being used to coordinate artillery strikes and aerial attacks against German supply lines. Private Kowalski had proven himself to be far more than just another replacement soldier. Despite his wounded shoulder, the kid had become Murphy's unofficial intelligence officer, interpreting the captured German maps and identifying key terrain features that could be used to advantage. His ability to read German, learned from his immigrant grandparents in Chicago, had made him invaluable in interrogating prisoners and translating captured documents. "Sarge," Kowalski called out as they approached the outskirts of St. Laurent, "I've been studying these maps, and I think we've got a problem. The Germans have a reserve battalion positioned about 3 kilometers southeast of here, the 352nd Infantry Regiment. If they get organized and counterattack, they could push us right back into the sea." Murphy studied the terrain through his binoculars, noting the network of hedgerows and stone walls that would provide excellent defensive positions for German forces moving north toward the beach. The Norman Bocage country was a defender's paradise, with every field enclosed by earthen banks topped with dense vegetation that could conceal an entire company. How long before they can reach us? Murphy asked. Depends on how fast they can reorganize after losing their command structure. Maybe 2 hours if they're professional, 4 hours if they're confused and cautious. That gave them a narrow window of opportunity to consolidate their position and prepare for the inevitable counterattack. Murphy began positioning his men along the ridge line that overlooked the main road from Bayou, using the stone walls and farm buildings to create interlocking fields of fire. Sergeant O'Brien had survived the assault on the bunker with only minor wounds, and he was now directing the emplacement of captured German machine guns that would provide devastating firepower against any attack up the main road. Corporal Martinez had managed to establish reliable communication with both the beach headquarters and the naval fire support teams offshore, ensuring that they could call for help if the situation deteriorated. As recorded in the memoirs of Brigadier General Norman Cota, published in his post-war account The Longest Day Remembered, the consolidation phase of the D-Day operation was often more challenging than the initial assault, as scattered units had to organize themselves into coherent defensive positions, while still under pressure from German counterattacks. The first probe came at 15:30 hours, a reinforced company of German infantry supported by 2 Panzer IV tanks moving cautiously up the road from Bayou. Murphy's men held their fire until the enemy column was well within the killing zone, then unleashed a coordinated ambush that destroyed both tanks and scattered the infantry into the surrounding hedgerows. But Murphy knew this was just the beginning. The captured German radio traffic that Martinez was monitoring indicated that a full battalion-strength counterattack was being organized, under the command of Major Hans Kruger, a veteran of the Russian front who had been rushed to Normandy, specifically to deal with airborne and amphibious threats. They're bringing up everything they've got, Martinez reported, his face grim as he listened to the German transmissions, artillery, armor, even some of those new Panzerfaust rocket launchers we've been hearing about. Murphy checked his ammunition supply and wasn't encouraged by what he found. His improvised battle group had enough small arms ammunition for perhaps one sustained engagement, and their mortar rounds were already running low. If they were going to hold this position, they would need immediate resupply from the beach. Can you raise Colonel Taylor? Murphy asked Martinez. The radio crackled with static for several seconds before Taylor's familiar voice came through clearly. This is Taylor. What's your situation? Murphy, sir. We're holding the St. Laurent crossroads with about the company's worth of mixed units. Intelligence indicates a major counterattack developing from the southeast. We need ammunition, medical supplies, and preferably some armor support. Roger that, Murphy. I'm sending a supply convoy up as soon as we can clear the beach exits. Can you hold until 1700 hours? Murphy looked at his watch. That was 90 minutes away, and the German attack would likely develop long before then. We'll hold, sir. No choice in the matter. As the afternoon wore on, the sounds of battle continued to echo across the Norman countryside. Murphy could see smoke rising from a dozen different locations, where American and German forces were engaged in the deadly business of determining who would control this vital piece of real estate. Private Kowalski had established himself in the bell tower of the village church, where his elevated position gave him an excellent view of the surrounding terrain. Using a captured German telescope, he was tracking enemy movements and relaying information back to Murphy's command post. In the stone schoolhouse, movement to the southeast. Kowalski's voice crackled through the field telephone. Looks like infantry in company strength, moving through the hedgerows about 800 meters out. It's Sarge, I could see armor. At least 3 tanks, maybe more. Murphy felt the familiar tightening in his stomach that preceded major combat. His men were tired, low on ammunition, and facing an enemy that outnumbered them at least 2-1. But they held the high ground. They had good fields of fire, and most importantly, they had the moral advantage of men who had already accomplished the impossible once today. All positions. This is Murphy, he called into his radio. Enemy attack developing from the southeast. Hold your fire until they're within 300 meters, then make every shot count. We're not retreating from this position. The German attack, when it came, was a masterpiece of tactical coordination. Major Kruger had deployed his forces in a textbook assault formation, with infantry advancing under cover of artillery fire, while his tanks provided mobile fire support from hold-down positions. It was exactly the kind of attack that had swept across Poland, France, and Russia with devastating effectiveness. But this was not the same German army that had conquered Europe in 1940. In 1941, these were older men, many of them recent conscripts or troops transferred from quiet sectors, where they had seen little combat. They lacked the aggressive confidence of the early war period, and more importantly, they were facing American soldiers who refused to be intimidated. The battle raged for 3 hours. With neither side able to gain a decisive advantage, German infantry would advance to within striking distance of the American positions, only to be driven back by concentrated rifle fire and well-placed grenades. The German tanks proved to be less effective than expected, as the narrow roads and high hedgerows limited their mobility and made them vulnerable to bazooka attacks. Murphy was directing fire from the schoolhouse when a German artillery shell exploded in the courtyard, showering him with broken glass and plaster. He felt something warm running down his face and realized he'd been cut by flying debris, but the wow was superficial and he continued to coordinate the defense. The turning point came when Sergeant O'Brien spotted a German officer trying to rally his men for another assault. O'Brien's rifle shot dropped the officer cleanly, and the attack faltered as the German infantry lost their immediate leadership. Within minutes, the entire enemy force was withdrawing in disorder, leaving behind their dead and wounded as they retreated toward the safety of their own lines. As the sun set over the Norman countryside on June 6, 1944, Murphy stood among the ruins of St. Lawrence-sur-Mer and surveyed the cost of victory. His improvised battle group had held the crossroads, but at a terrible price. Of the 200 men who had started the day, barely half remained effective for combat. The rest were dead, wounded, or scattered among the 8 stations that had been established in every intact building. Private Kowalski was sitting against the church wall, his wounded shoulder finally receiving proper medical attention from a Navy corpsman who had arrived with the late afternoon supply convoy. The kid's uniform was filthy and torn. His face was streaked with curdite and dry blood, but his eyes held the quiet confidence of a soldier who had proven himself under fire. "Think we'll make it home for Christmas, Sarge?" Kowalski asked, echoing his question from the night before. Murphy looked out over the beachhead that now stretched for miles along the Norman coast, where thousands of American soldiers were continuing to pour ashore despite the ongoing German resistance. LSTs were unloading trucks, jeeps, and artillery pieces directly onto the sand, while combat engineers worked frantically to clear obstacles and establish supply routes. "Yeah, kid," Murphy replied, and for the first time since the landing craft had dropped its ramp 12 hours earlier, he actually believed it. "I think we're going to make it home just fine. The invasion of Fortress Europe has succeeded." But Murphy knew that the road to Berlin would be long and bloody. There would be other beaches, other fortresses, other desperate battles where American soldiers would be called upon to do the impossible. But they had proven today that it could be done, that free men fighting for a just cause could overcome any obstacle. The longest day was ending, but the fight for freedom was just beginning, and Staff Sergeant William Murphy, along with thousands of other ordinary Americans who had done extraordinary things, would see it through to the end. In the decades that followed D-Day, historians would analyze every aspect of the Normandy invasion, from the grand strategic decisions made in London and Washington to the individual acts of heroism performed on the beaches of France. The official casualty figures would record that the Allies suffered approximately 10,000 casualties on June 6, 1944, with about 2,400 killed in action. But behind those statistics were the stories of men like Staff Sergeant William Murphy, Private Tommy Kowalski, and Staff Sergeant Robert Sullivan, ordinary soldiers who found themselves capable of extraordinary courage when their country and their comrades needed them most. Their sacrifice and determination had opened the door to victory in Europe, and their legacy would inspire future generations of Americans who would be called upon to defend freedom in distant lands. The beaches of Normandy are quiet now, marked by monuments and memorials that honor the men who died there. But on June 6, 1944, those beaches witnessed the triumph of democracy over tyranny, of courage over fear, and of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. In the cause of human freedom, the story of D-Day is ultimately the story of America itself, a nation of immigrants and farmers, factory workers and college students, who came together in their hour of greatest trial and changed the course of human history. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, read, and honored for as long as free people walked the earth.